In the summer of 1943, Luftwaffe ace Major Wilhelm Reinhardt watched through his canopy as a formation of American B-17 bombers crawled across the German sky alone, unescorted, vulnerable. He smiled beneath his oxygen mask. His squadron had dubbed these missions Amerikanische Truthähne, American turkeys, easy prey. Reinhardt had shot down 23 Allied aircraft. Today would add 4 more to his tally. What he didn't know, as he positioned his Focke-Wulf 190 for the kill, was that those defenseless bombers bristled with 13 50-caliber machine guns each, and the men behind those guns had trained for exactly this moment. In the next 11 minutes, Reinhardt's squadron would learn a lesson written in tracers and blood, one that would fundamentally alter Luftwaffe tactics for the remainder of the war. The story begins not in the sky over Germany, but in a frozen training field outside Pueblo, Colorado, in January 1943. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Technical Sergeant Robert MacAllister stood in snow up to his shins, his breath forming clouds in the -15-degree air, staring at the twin 50-caliber Browning machine guns mounted in the tail position mock-up. At 22 years old, Mac had never fired a weapon before enlisting. He'd been a grocery clerk in Pittsburgh. Now, 6 months into his training as a tail gunner, he could field strip these guns blindfolded, clear a jam in under 8 seconds, and calculate lead angles for targets moving at 300 miles per hour. But standing in that Colorado cold, Mac wasn't thinking about technical proficiency. He was thinking about the letter in his footlocker from his older brother Jimmy, a B-24 pilot who'd flown 12 missions over North Africa. Jimmy's words had been carefully chosen to pass the censors, but their meaning was clear. The Germans are good, Mac. Better than anyone tells you. Don't believe the newsreels. When they come for you, and they will come, you'd better be ready to kill them before they kill you. MacAllister, you daydreaming or freezing to death? Master Sergeant Dale Kowalski approached through the snow, his instructor's clipboard tucked under one arm. Kowalski was 38, ancient by aircrew standards, with a face like cured leather and eyes that had seen things Mac could only imagine. He'd flown 25 missions as a waist gunner before being rotated stateside to train the next wave. Neither, Sarge. Just thinking. Thinking gets you killed at 25,000 feet. Kowalski tapped the gun mount. Muscle memory keeps you alive. Now get in position. We're running the ambush drill again. Mac climbed into the cramped tail position. The space was barely large enough for a man to crouch, surrounded by ammunition boxes, the guns, and not much else. Through the plexiglass, he had a sweeping view of the sky behind the aircraft, or in this case, the snow-covered training field. Here's what you need to understand, Kowalski said, his voice taking on the lecture tone Mac had heard dozens of times. The Luftwaffe thinks they've got us figured out. They've been at this since 1939. Their pilots have experience our boys don't. Their tactics are refined. And when they see a formation of B-17 seconds without fighter escort, which is most missions right now, because our P-47 seconds can't fly deep enough into Germany, yet they think it's Christmas morning. Kowalski pulled out a worn photograph and held it where Mac could see. It showed a B-17 with its entire tail section shredded, barely hanging on. This bird made it home. The tail gunner didn't. You know why? Mac shook his head. Because he froze. Not from cold, from fear. German fighter came in from 6 o'clock low, the most vulnerable angle for a tail gunner, and this kid locked up, didn't fire a single round. Kowalski's voice dropped. The German pilot put a 2-second burst through this position. Kid was 19. From Ohio. Mac felt his stomach tighten. I'm not telling you this to scare you, Kowalski continued. I'm telling you this because when you're up there, when you see that Focke-Wulf or Messerschmitt coming at you with its nose lit up like a Christmas tree, your training is the only thing between you and what happened to that kid from Ohio. The B-17 gives you the tools. 13. 50 cals, covering every angle. But tools don't mean shit if the men behind them don't do their jobs. Over the next 3 months, Mac and his crew, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineer, radio operator, ball turret gunner, and 2 waist gunners trained until they moved as one organism. They learned that the B-17's defensive armament was a carefully designed system of overlapping fields of fire, twin guns in the tail, twin guns in the top turret, twin guns in the ball turret beneath the fuselage, single guns in the nose and radio room, and 1 gun in each waist position. 13 guns total, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. But the genius wasn't in the guns themselves, it was in the coordination. A single B-17 is vulnerable. Their aircraft commander, Captain James Thornton, explained during a briefing in March. Thornton was 26, but carried himself like a man twice that age. He'd washed out of fighter training due to depth perception issues, but had found his calling in the left seat of a bomber. German fighters can isolate you, come at you from the sun, exploit your blind spots. But a tight formation? That's a different story. Thornton sketched on the blackboard, drawing boxes representing bombers in a combat box formation, the standard defensive arrangement that would become the backbone of the 8th Air Force's daylight bombing campaign. 18 bombers in a combat box, each with 13 guns. That's 234 machine guns, creating interlocking fields of fire. A German fighter trying to attack any single bomber has to fly through a cone of lead from multiple aircraft. The key is discipline. Hold formation, trust your wingman. Fire when you have a clear shot. Conserve ammunition for when you need it most. Mac raised his hand. Sir, what if fighters do break through? What if they get to us before we can? Then, you do your job, Sergeant. Thornton's eyes were hard. You put rounds on target. You protect your crew. You make the German pilot regret choosing your aircraft. Every mission, men die because they hesitate or panic. Don't be one of them. In April 1943, Mac's crew received their assignment. The 381st Bombardment Group, stationed at RAF Ridgewell in Essex, England. They would be flying B-17F serial number 42 to 30177, which their crew christened Devil's Dealer, after a marathon poker game their first night in England. The nose art showed a grinning demon dealing cards, painted by their bombardier, Lieutenant Frank Chen, who'd been a commercial artist in San Francisco. Their first mission briefing came on the 14th of May 1943. The target, the submarine pens at Kiel, Germany, a deep penetration mission that would take them far beyond the range of friendly fighter escort. Mac remembered sitting in the briefing room, surrounded by 30 other crews, as the intelligence officer pulled back the curtain to reveal the map. A collective groan went up. The red ribbon stretched from England, across the North Sea, deep into Germany, then back. 7 hours in the air, at least 4 hours without fighter cover. Gentlemen, the intelligence officer said, expect heavy fighter opposition. Luftwaffe units in this sector include Jagdgeschwader 1 and Jagdgeschwader 11, experienced units with high kill ratios. They will come at you in waves. Frontal attacks, tail attacks, attacks from high and low. They will try to separate stragglers. They will exploit any gap in your formation. Is to maintain formation discipline, put ordnance on target, and get yourselves and your aircraft home. Questions? A lieutenant in the back raised his hand. Sir, any chance of fighter escort past the coast? Negative. P-47 seconds will take you to the Dutch border and pick you up on the way out. In between, you're on your own. That night, Mac couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk in the cold Nissen hut, listening to the sounds of 40 men trying to quiet their minds before combat. Some played cards, some wrote letters, some prayed. Mac cleaned his guns for the 3rd time that day, the mechanical action soothing his nerves. His crewmate in the upper bunk, waist gunner Tony DeLuca from Brooklyn, leaned over. Hey Mac, you scared? Mac thought about lying, then figured there was no point. Yeah, you. Terrified. My old man fought in the last war. He told me the waiting is worse than the fighting. Said once it starts, you're too busy to be scared. Hope he's right. Me too. Brother, me too. At 0430 hours on May 15, Mac woke to the sound of a sergeant walking through the hut, calling crews to breakfast. The mess hall was quiet, none of the usual banter. Men ate mechanically powdered eggs, toast, coffee, strong enough to strip paint. Chaplains moved among the tables, offering quiet words to those who wanted them. At 0600, the crews assembled at their aircraft. Devil's Dealer sat on her hardstand, ground crew making final checks. The armourer had loaded all 13 gun positions, thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition in linked belts. Each round was as long as Mac's hand, capable of punching through engine blocks at 1,000 yards. Captain Thornton gathered the crew for final words. "We've trained for this. We know our jobs. We stick together. We follow procedure. We come home." "Understood?" 10 voices responded as one. "Yes, sir." "Then, let's get to work." Mac climbed through the small door in the fuselage, squeezed past the waist guns, and crawled into his tail. Position. He plugged in his heated suit. It would be 50 below zero, at altitude, connected his oxygen mask and intercom, then checked his guns. He loaded the first belt, charged both weapons, tested the traversing mechanism. Everything worked smoothly. Tail gunner to pilot, guns checked and ready. "Roger, tail. All positions report ready." One by one, the voices came through Mac's headset. Engineer, radio, ball turret, waist gunners, top turret, bombardier, navigator. Each man confirming his station was prepared. At 0715, engines coughed to life across the airfield. The sound was overwhelming dozens of Wright Cyclone engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, warming up for the mission ahead. Through his plexiglass window, Mac watched other B-17 seconds in their group beginning to taxi, a long line of bombers heading toward the runway. Devil's Dealer lurched forward, following the line. Mac felt every bump in the taxiway, heard every creak of the airframe. For a moment, the enormity of what they were about to do hit him. They were going to fly hundreds of miles into enemy territory, drop bombs on a heavily defended target, then fly home through fighters and flak. The odds of all 10 crewmen surviving their required 25 missions were statistically slim. Most crews lost at least one man. Many lost everyone. But then Captain Thornton's voice came through the intercom, steady and calm. "Devil's Dealer rolling for takeoff. Crew, check in." And Mac, along with 9 other young men, confirmed ready. The B-17 accelerated down the runway, 65,000 pounds of aircraft, fuel, bombs, and ammunition fighting for lift. Mac felt the tail wheel leave the ground first, then the mains, and suddenly they were airborne, climbing into the grey English dawn. The assembly took an hour. 36 aircraft forming into 2 combat boxes, stacked at different altitudes. Mac watched through his window as bombers manoeuvred into position, wingtips sometimes only feet apart. It was both terrifying and beautiful, this deadly ballet of 4-engine aircraft. At 0900, the formation turned east and headed for the North Sea. Behind them, England disappeared into morning mist. Ahead lay Europe, and the gauntlet they would have to run. "Pilot to crew, we're crossing the coast. Fighter escort is with us P47 seconds at 11 o'clock high. Stay sharp. Call out any bandits immediately." Mac scanned the sky through his window, his hands resting on the gun grips. The tail position gave him a sweeping view behind and below the aircraft. If German fighters came from the rear, and they often did, he would be the first to see them. 30 minutes later, the P-47 seconds waggled their wings and turned back, reaching the limit of their range. The bomber stream continued on, alone now, pushing deeper into Germany. "Pilot to crew, we've lost our escort. Eyes open. Expect company any time now." Mac's mouth went dry. This was it. The moment all the training had prepared them for. Somewhere ahead, Luftwaffe fighter controllers were watching their radar scopes, plotting intercepts, vectoring their units toward the American formation. German pilots were climbing into their cockpits, starting their engines, taking off to defend their homeland. And among them was Major Wilhelm Reinhardt, leader of 2, JG-1, who had already shot down 23 Allied aircraft and was about to learn that American bombers were not the easy targets he believed them to be. At 1047 hours, the radio operator's voice crackled through the intercom. Bandits. Bandits at 12 o'clock high. Looks like, Jesus, at least 30 of them. Mac twisted in his position, trying to see forward, but his view was blocked by the fuselage. Tail to crew. I can't see them. Someone talk to me. Top turret here. I've got visual. Focke-Wulf, 190 seconds, coming in from the nose. They're forming up for. Here they come, and then the sky exploded. The German fighters dove through the formation in waves, 4 and 6 at a time, their cannon and machine guns flashing. The sound was indescribable, the roar of engines, the hammering of 50 calibers, the crash of cannon shells hitting metal, the shouts of men on the intercom. Mac's training took over. He traversed his guns, searching for targets. The tail position's job was to protect the rear of the aircraft and the formation behind them. If fighters broke through the initial defense and tried to come around for a tail attack, Mac would be waiting. Ball turret to crew. One diving away. He's trailing smoke. Bombardier to crew. We're hit in the nose. Co-pilot's wounded. Waist to pilot. Number 3 engine on the aircraft to our right just exploded. The intercom became a chaos of voices, each man reporting threats, damage, kills. Mac forced himself to focus on his sector, to not be distracted by the battle raging in every direction. Then he saw them for 190 seconds that had swept through the formation from the front, dove beneath the bomber stream, and were now climbing back up from below, positioning for a tail attack on Devil's Dealer. Tail to crew, 2 bandits, 6 o'clock low, climbing. Roger, tail. They're yours, take 'em. Mac centered his guns on the lead fighter, still 800 yards away. Too far. He waited, watching the fighter grow larger in his sight. The German pilot was good, jinking slightly to throw off Mac's aim, but climbing steadily. 600 yards, 500. At 400 yards, Mac squeezed the triggers. Both. 50 calibers erupted, the vibration shaking his entire compartment. He walked the tracers toward the fighter, adjusting for lead and deflection. The W-190 grew larger, its radial engine visible now, its guns beginning to wink as the pilot returned fire. Rounds from the Germans' weapons stitched across Devil's Dealer's fuselage, some passing within feet of Mac's position. He ignored them, kept his focus on the sight picture, kept firing. His tracers reached out, touched the fighter, and suddenly pieces began flying off its wing. The Felv 190 rolled hard right, breaking off the attack, trailing smoke. Tail to crew, 1 damaged, breaking away. Second one still coming. The second German pilot had watched his wingman's attack fail and adjusted his approach, coming in from a slightly different angle. Mac traversed to track him, but the fighter was faster, closing the gap. At 200 yards, both pilots fired simultaneously. The world went mad. German cannon shells ripped through the tail section, punching holes the size of dinner plates in the thin aluminum. One round exploded near Mac's left gun, showering him with fragments. His heated suit was shredded. Blood ran down his face from a cut above his eye. But his guns still worked, and he kept firing. The full 190 flashed past underneath, so close Mac could see the pilot's face, could see the expression change from confidence to alarm as 50 caliber rounds tore into his aircraft's belly. The fighter staggered, rolled inverted, and began spinning toward the earth, trailing fire. Tail to crew. I got him. Second one's going down. Good shooting, Mac. You okay back there? Mac wiped blood from his eye, took inventory. He was bleeding from a dozen small cuts. His left arm felt numb, and the tail section looked like Swiss cheese. But he was alive, and his guns still functioned. Tail to pilot. I'm hit but operational. Guns still good. The battle raged for another 15 minutes as German fighters made pass after pass at the formation. The B-17 seconds held together, their defensive fire creating exactly the wall of lead that designers had envisioned. Fighters that pressed their attacks too aggressively flew into streams of tracers from multiple aircraft. Those that broke off early did little damage. Gradually, The German attack slackened as the fighters ran low on fuel and ammunition. They peeled away in ones and twos, heading back to their bases. Behind them, the bomber formation continued toward Kiel, more ragged now, with several aircraft trailing smoke and struggling to keep up, but still together, still pressing toward the target. Mac slumped in his position, adrenaline draining away, replaced by exhaustion and pain. Through his window, he could see 3 aircraft falling behind, losing altitude. He counted the parachutes as crews bailed out. Not enough. There were never enough parachutes. But Devil's Dealer was still flying. Captain Thornton was still in control, and Mac's guns were still ready if the Germans came back. They would reach Kiel, drop their bombs, and face the long flight home. The day was far from over, but Mac had learned something in those 15 minutes of combat. The Germans might have experience and skill, but American bombers were not defenseless prey. They were flying fortresses, bristling with guns, and crewed by men who had trained for exactly this kind of fight. And Major Wilhelm Reinhardt, nursing his damaged Focke-Wulf back to his base near Hamburg, had learned the same lesson from the opposite perspective. The American bombers were not turkey shoots. They were deadly adversaries that demanded respect and new tactics. The air war over Europe had entered a new phase, one written in tracer fire and blood at 25,000 feet. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The debriefing room at RAF Ridgewell smelled of cigarette smoke, coffee, and fear sweat. 36 crews had taken off that morning, 31 returned. 5 bombers, 50 men had been shot down or crashed. Another 8 aircraft were so heavily damaged they'd never fly again. Mac sat with his crew, still wearing his blood-stained flight suit, as intelligence officers moved from table to table collecting mission reports. His hands shook as he tried to light a cigarette. Tony DeLuca, the waist gunner, finally took the matches and lit it for him. "You did good up there, Mac," Tony said quietly. "Those 2 full 190 seconds would have chewed us apart if you hadn't. I killed 2 men today." Mac's voice was flat, emotionless. "I watched one of them burn all the way down." Captain Thornton, sitting across the table with a bandage wrapped around his head where shrapnel had grazed his scalp, leaned forward. "You saved 10 men today. Your crew. Don't forget that part." The intelligence officer reached their table, a young lieutenant with a clipboard and tired eyes. "Devil's Dealer, correct? I need your damage assessment and combat claims." For the next hour, each crew member described what they'd seen, what they'd shot at, what had shot at them. The intelligence officer noted everything: number of enemy fighters engaged, their types and markings, their tactics, which ones were damaged or destroyed. This information would be compiled, analyzed, sent up the chain to 8th Air Force headquarters, where staff officers would use it to refine tactics and training. When Mac described his 2 kills, the officer's pencil paused. "You're certain about the 2nd aircraft? Confirmed destruction?" "It was inverted and on fire, sir. Spinning. The pilot didn't get out." The officer made a note. "That's 2 confirmed kills for Technical Sergeant MacAllister. Congratulations." Mac felt nothing. No pride, no satisfaction. Just a hollow exhaustion that went bone deep. 3 days later, Mac found himself in the tail position again, this time over the Ruhr Valley, the most heavily defended industrial region in Germany. The mission briefing had called it Happy Valley, but there was nothing happy about it. Anti-aircraft guns so thick that, as one veteran pilot put it, you could walk across the sky on the flak bursts. But this time, the German fighters stayed away. They'd learned from Kiel. Instead of pressing suicidal attacks against tight formations, they circled at a distance, waiting for stragglers, for wounded aircraft that fell behind the protection of the combat box. Mac watched through his window as a B-17 from another group, its number 2 engine streaming smoke, gradually lost altitude and speed. The German fighters swarmed like sharks, scenting blood. Within minutes, the straggler was burning, spinning earthward. Only 4 parachutes emerged before it exploded. Pilot to crew, Thornton's voice was grim. "That's why we hold formation no matter what. You fall behind, you die. Everyone clear? 10 voices, confirmed understanding. But while the 8th Air Force was learning how to fight in the daylight skies over Europe, so was the Luftwaffe. And at an airfield near Hanover, Major Wilhelm Reinhardt was developing new tactics that would make the summer of 1943 the bloodiest period of the bomber offensive. Reinhardt's FOV 190 had taken 3 weeks to repair after the Kiel mission. During that time, he'd interviewed every pilot in his squadron about their experiences attacking the American formations. What emerged was a clear picture. Frontal and tail attacks against tight formations resulted in unacceptable losses. The defensive firepower was simply too intense. But the Americans had weaknesses that could be exploited. He gathered his pilots in the operations room on the 8th of June 1943, 18 men, ranging in age from 19 to 34, with kill totals from 2 to 47. They were experienced, skilled, and after recent losses, cautious. Gentlemen, Reinhardt began, pointing to reconnaissance photos of B-17 formations. We have been attacking these aircraft the wrong way. We press home our attacks from the nose or tail, flying through concentrated defensive fire, taking heavy damage for marginal results. This must change. He traced a line on the photos with his finger. The American combat box formation has gaps vertical and horizontal spacing between aircraft. If we attack from high angles, diving through these gaps at maximum speed, we minimize our exposure to defensive fire. We make one pass, hit hard, then dive away before they can bring all their guns to bear. A young lieutenant raised his hand. Major, won't diving attacks make it harder to aim? Yes, which is why we must train specifically for this profile. Starting tomorrow, we will practice high-speed diving attacks until we can consistently hit targets. We will also use heavier armament, the 21-centimeter rockets. One hit from a Werfer Granat 21 will destroy a bomber instantly. Another pilot, Oberleutnant Hans Becker, who'd flown on the Eastern Front before transferring west, spoke up. And if they close the gaps in their formation? Then they sacrifice bombing accuracy. The tighter they fly, the more difficult it becomes for their bombardiers to acquire individual targets. Either way, we win. Reinhardt's smile was cold. The Americans believe their formations make them invincible. We will teach them otherwise. On the 13th of June 1943, Reinhardt's new tactics were put to the test during a raid on Bremen. His squadron attacked from 28,000 feet, diving through the formation at over 400 miles per hour, firing rockets and cannon in short, devastating bursts before breaking away. They shot down 4 bombers and damaged 6 others without losing a single fighter. The Americans, caught off guard by the new approach, scrambled to respond. Formation spacing was adjusted. Gun positions were modified to improve high-angle coverage. But the fundamental problem remained. German fighters could choose when and where to attack, while the bombers had to maintain formation and course toward their targets. Mac's crew flew their 10th mission on the 2nd of July 1943, a raid on Le Mans in occupied France. It was supposed to be a milk run, relatively light opposition. It became a nightmare. Reinhardt's squadron, now joined by other units employing similar tactics, attacked with rockets for the first time. Mac watched in horror as a B-17 inches, the high squadron simply disintegrated, when a 21-centimeter rocket struck its bomb bay. The explosion was so massive that aircraft 300 yards away took damage from flying debris. Tail to pilot. They're using rockets. Big ones. I saw it, Mac. Everyone stay alert. They'll be coming back. They did. Wave after wave of fighters diving through the formation at impossible speeds, launching rockets from beyond effective 50 caliber range, then disappearing before defensive fire could touch them. By the time Devil's Dealer reached Le Mans, 6 aircraft from their group had been destroyed. The bombing run itself was routine by comparison. Flak was moderate. The target, a rail yard, was hit accurately. But the return flight brought more fighters, more rockets, more death. When they finally crossed the English coast, only 24 of the original 36 aircraft remained. Mac climbed out of his tail position at Ridgewell, unable to speak. He'd fired over 2,000 rounds, claimed one fighter damaged, and felt like he'd accomplished nothing. The Germans had adapted. The advantage the B-17's defensive armament had provided was evaporating. That night, in the officers' club where enlisted gunners were allowed after particularly rough missions, Mac overheard a conversation between Captain Thornton and another aircraft commander. "We can't sustain these loss rates," the other captain was saying. 10% today, 12% on the Kiel mission. If this continues, the statistical chance of completing 25 missions drops to nearly zero. What's headquarters saying? They're rushing the P-51 development, longer-range fighters that can escort us all the way to the target and back. But that's months away, maybe longer. In the meantime... He trailed off, the implication clear. In the meantime, men would die. Mac drank his beer and tried not to think about the mathematics of survival. But the numbers were inescapable. His crew had flown 10 missions. They needed 15, more to rotate home. Current loss rates suggested that fewer than 30% of crews completed their tours, which meant statistically 7 of Devil's Dealer's 10 crewmen would be dead or prisoners of war before Christmas. He ordered another beer. The summer of 1943 became known as Black Summer among 8th Air Force crews. Missions to Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and other deep targets in Germany resulted in staggering losses. On August 17, a dual raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg cost 60 bombers and 600 men in a single day, the worst losses of the war to date. Mac's crew flew both missions that day, part of the Regensburg force that continued south to bases in North Africa rather than returning to England. Devil's Dealer took hits from fighters and flak, but made it to Africa with 3 engines, a wounded navigator, and over 200 holes in the airframe. They spent a week in Tunisia, while Devil's Dealer was patched up enough to fly back to England. During that time, Mac walked along the Mediterranean coast, trying to process what he'd seen. The Regensburg mission had been apocalyptic fighters attacking from every angle, rockets and cannon fire filling the sky, bombers falling like burning leaves. He'd shot down 1 fighter, possibly 2, but it felt meaningless. For every German fighter that went down, 2 B-17 seconds followed. Tony found him on the beach on the 3rd day. "Crew meeting tonight. Thornton wants to talk about something." That evening, gathered in a tent, Captain Thornton laid out a stark reality. "We've flown 15 missions, 10 more, and we rotate home. But the math says most of us won't make it. We all know this." No one spoke. "So, here's what I'm proposing," Thornton continued. "We stop thinking about 25 missions. We think about the next one. Just the next one. We do our jobs. We watch each other's backs. We give ourselves the best possible chance. And if we're lucky, we do it 25 times. But we don't look ahead. We don't count. We just fly." It was simple psychology, but it worked. The crushing weight of statistical impossibility became manageable when reduced to a single mission, a single day. They flew back to England on August 28 and were immediately scheduled for a mission to Stuttgart, then Emden, then Nantes. Each time, Mac climbed into his tail position, expecting to die, and somehow didn't. The missions blurred together: wake up, briefing, takeoff, assembly, penetration, fighters, flak, bombing, fighters again, home, debriefing, sleep, repeat. September became October. October became November. Devil's Dealer absorbed more damage, was repaired, flew again. Co-pilot Lieutenant Harris was killed by a 20mm shell on the 20th mission, replaced by Lieutenant Morrison. Ball turret gunner Williams was wounded on mission 22, replaced by Sergeant Hayes. The crew that had flown together since May was slowly being rebuilt, piece by piece. And then, on the 3rd of November 1943, everything changed. Mac was in the briefing room for Mission 24 when the intelligence officer pulled back the curtain to reveal the target. Wilhelmshaven, a major German port. The red ribbon stretched deep into Germany as always, but this time there was something different. "Gentlemen," the intelligence officer said, "for the first time, You will have fighter escort for the entire mission. P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks. They'll take you in and bring you home." The room erupted in cheers. Mac felt tears in his eyes. Fighter escort. The one thing they'd been begging for, dying for, since the campaign began. American fighters that could go the distance, could protect them from the FIRV 192nds and BF 109nds, could level the playing field. The next morning, as Devil's Dealer crossed the Dutch coast, Mac saw them sleek P-51 seconds with their distinctive profiles, weaving above and around the bomber formation. Within minutes, they were earning their keep. German fighters appeared. But now they faced not just bomber defensive fire, but also dedicated air superiority fighters, flown by pilots who'd trained specifically for this mission. The air battle lasted 30 minutes. Mac, watching from his tail position, saw 3 German fighters shot down by P-51 seconds before they could even begin their attack runs. 2 more were damaged and driven off. Only a handful got through to the bombers, and those were harried and forced to break off their attacks early. Devil's Dealer reached Wilhelmshaven without firing a shot. They dropped their bombs, turned for home, and the entire trip back was covered by a rotating escort of P-51 seconds. Not a single bomber from their group was lost. The debriefing that night had a different tone. For the first time, men were smiling, joking, confident. The tide was turning. The long-range fighters weren't just protecting bombers. They were seeking out German fighters, hunting them, destroying them. The Luftwaffe's advantage was disappearing. Mac flew his 25th and final mission on the 18th of November 1943, a raid on Gelsenkirchen. With P-51 escort throughout, it was almost boring. German fighters stayed away. Flak was moderate. They bombed the synthetic oil plant, turned for home, landed at Ridgewell by early afternoon. Captain Thornton gathered the crew, those original members who'd survived on the hardstand next to Devil's Dealer. Mac, Tony, engineer Kowalski, no relation to Mac's instructor, and radio operator Chen. 6 men had rotated out due to wounds or completed tours earlier, replaced by newer crew. 25 missions, Thornton said simply. We did what we were told to do. We're going home. Mac looked at Devil's Dealer scarred, patched, barely resembling the pristine bomber they'd flown in May. Over 300 mission symbols were painted beneath the cockpit window. 47 bomb symbols, 12 fighter kill marks. The aircraft had brought them through hell and back, 25 times. Asked. Go ahead. We didn't win this alone. It was the guys who didn't make it, the crews that went down so we could learn, the engineers who designed these birds to take a beating, the ground crews who kept them flying, the fighter pilots who finally came to help us. We were just... He struggled for words. We were just part of something bigger. Thornton nodded. The biggest air campaign in history, and we were here for it. 3 days later, Mac boarded a C-54 transport for the flight back to the States. As the aircraft lifted off from Ridgewell, he looked out the window at the rows of B-17 seconds, preparing for another mission. New crews, fresh from training, climbing into aircraft that would carry them into the same battles Mac had survived. He wondered how many of them would make it. The final piece of the story belongs to Major Wilhelm Reinhardt. On the 11th of January 1944, during a mission to Oschersleben, his Foth 190 was jumped by a flight of P-51 seconds while he was positioning for an attack on a B-17 formation. In the brief dogfight that followed, Reinhardt, ace of 41 kills, was shot down by a 23-year-old pilot from Iowa, flying his 8th mission. Reinhardt survived, bailed out with burns on his hands and face, spent 3 weeks in a hospital, and returned to his unit in February. But the war he'd known was over. American fighters now ranged freely over Germany, hunting Luftwaffe aircraft wherever they found them. The bomber formations he'd once viewed as easy targets were now protected by fighters that matched or exceeded the performance of Germany's best aircraft. On the 15th of March 1944, Reinhardt was shot down again, this time by defensive fire from a B-17-13, 50-caliber machine guns, fired by a crew that had trained specifically to kill pilots like him. He did not survive. The weapons remained the same, the B-17, the 50 caliber Browning, the interlocking fields of fire. But the tactics, the escort, the experience, all had evolved. The aircraft that German pilots had mocked as American turkeys in the summer of 1943 had become, by early 1944, the centerpiece of a devastating air campaign that systematically destroyed Germany's ability to wage war. Mack learned of Reinhardt's death years later, when he was researching for a book about his experiences. He felt no satisfaction, no sense of revenge, just a weary recognition that Reinhardt had been doing his job, just as Mack had been doing his. They'd been men caught in a war neither had started, fighting with skill and courage for their respective sides. The difference, the crucial, deciding difference, was that American industry could replace bombers and crews faster than German fighters could shoot them down. And once long-range escorts arrived, even that brutal equation changed in favor of the bombers. By war's end, over 12,000 B-17 seconds had been built. The 8th Air Force alone flew over 300,000 sorties, dropped over 700,000 tons of bombs, and suffered over 47,000 casualties. But they helped break the back of German industrial production, crippled the Luftwaffe, and paved the way for D-Day and the final defeat of Nazi Germany. Technical Sergeant Robert MacAllister returned to Pittsburgh in December 1943. He married his sweetheart, worked 30 years at a steel mill, raised 3 children, and rarely spoke about the war. But every November 3, the day he first flew with fighter escort, the day he knew they might actually survive, he would drive to a small airport outside Pittsburgh, watch planes take off and land, and remember. He remembered the friends who didn't come home. He remembered the terror and the boredom, the moments of stark beauty and absolute horror. He remembered what it felt like to be 22 years old, frozen at 25,000 feet, staring through a gun sight at another young man trying to kill him. Most of all, he remembered the lesson written in tracer fire across the skies of Europe, that courage and technology, properly combined with sound tactics and overwhelming resources, could defeat even the most skilled and determined enemy. The German pilots who'd mocked unescorted B-17 seconds in the spring of 1943 had learned that lesson the hard way. By the winter of 1944, most of them were dead. Their aircraft were superior in many ways, faster, more maneuverable, better armed. But it hadn't mattered. The B-17, with its 13, 50 caliber machine guns and the brave men who crewed them, had proven to be exactly what its name suggested. A flying fortress that could absorb tremendous damage, fight its way to the target and back, and ultimately help win a war. Mack died in 1987, at age 66, from lung disease, perhaps from the frozen air he'd breathed at altitude, or the cigarettes he'd smoked to calm his nerves, or simply the slow accumulation of years. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette mentioned that he was a veteran, that he'd flown in combat, that he'd been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. It didn't mention that he'd killed men to earn it, or that he'd carried the weight of those kills for 44 years, or that he'd wake sometimes in the night, sweating, hearing the phantom sound of 50 calibers hammering away in a cramped metal tube at 25,000 feet. Those were the parts of the story that couldn't be reduced to medals and mission counts. Those were the parts that belonged to Mack and the thousands of men like him, the ones who'd climbed into bombers day after day, knowing the odds, doing their jobs anyway, and somehow, against all probability, survived to tell about it. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its reputation one mission at a time, one crew at a time, one burst of 50 caliber fire at a time, and when German interceptors came, expecting easy victories, they found instead a wall of lead and a determination that could not be broken. That was the real lesson of the air war over Europe. Not that American bombers were invincible, they weren't. Not that German fighters were helpless, they weren't. But that courage, preparation, and the willingness to pay a terrible price could, in the end, overcome even the most skilled opposition. Mack understood this. So did Major Reinhardt, before the end. So did the thousands of men on both sides who fought at 5 miles high, where the temperature was 50 below zero and a single mistake meant death. The Sky over Germany in 1943 and 1944 was written in contrails and fire, in aluminum and blood. The story of the B-17 and its 13 50 caliber guns is just one chapter in that larger narrative, but it's a chapter worth remembering, worth telling, worth passing down to generations who will never know what it felt like to be 22 years old, frozen and terrified, and still pulling the trigger because that's what the mission required. Devil's Dealer flew 73 missions before being retired in late 1944. She was scrapped after the war, cut up for aluminum, but somewhere in Pittsburgh, in a frame on a wall, there's a photograph of 10 young men standing in front of their bomber, grinning despite everything they knew was coming. 7 of those men made it home, 3 didn't, and the bomber that carried them through 25 missions over the most heavily defended airspace in the world earned every scar, every patch, every mission marker painted beneath her cockpit. That's the story of German interceptors who mocked unescorted B-17 seconds until they faced 13 50 caliber machine guns in the hands of men who'd trained to use them, and learned that mockery is cheap, but respect is earned in blood and fire at 25,000 feet. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.